You're watching Beyond Markets. Welcome, I'm Kenneth Igbomo, and on today's show, we'll discuss how African countries can build resilience to climate change. You can join the conversation with the hashtag Beyond Markets. You can follow my handle at Kenneth Igbomo. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report says a temperature increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius or more could result in unprecedented risks and weather events, and the world must reduce emissions of greenhouse gases to net zero by the middle of this century to have a reasonable chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Naza Alakija, she's a climate change advocate and the founder of Sage Innovation Center, joins me to discuss how African countries can build resilience to climate change. So, listening to what the Intergovernmental Panel said on climate change, I'd like to get your thoughts on this as someone who advocates for climate change.
There's now a critical need for attention towards climate change, especially in continents like Africa and any region that suffers from poverty. We need to build resilience, and we need to develop programs that implement these practices that can develop equitable and sustainable trajectories out of poverty. Right now there's very little, we have little access to resources, access to information, access to social capital, and these are things that I really believe right now are crucial. And given what's been happening in the continent, especially with the climate emergencies, it is imminent that we do take action now.
All right, but looking at the work you've been doing and looking at how African governments are addressing this challenge, do you think African governments see this as a top priority or are giving it as much attention as you think it deserves?
I think there's more awareness, but I don't think that they are giving it the attention it deserves. Let's ask ourselves the questions. Do we have surveillance? Are we able to rescue civilians if there is a climate emergency? Are we able to provide resources such as food and water, in times of climate emergency? Do people have access to the information? If there is a climate, what do they do? And most importantly, are our emergency services prepared for something like this? I mean, look at Mozambique. It's really taken their economy backwards, and unless governments and all stakeholders come together and put an action in place, it really will have detrimental effects to the livelihood of individuals that will be affected by it.
All right, looking at building resilience, when you look at the impact of climate change, it takes on different forms in different countries.
Yeah.
Some are more direct,
yeah,
like you mentioned earlier with Mozambique, and some are a bit more indirect.
Yeah.
When you look at countries like, conflicts that come up because of people that are scrambling for resources in there, and then also the humanitarian crisis that is a fallout of this effect. But in looking at building resilience now, I'm trying to see how African governments can better first understand the topic and then, put mechanisms in place to address these challenges when they occur.
So I believe that the first thing we need is somebody that will handle we have someone in Nigeria that will handle all matters related to climate change, or a sector that will handle issues related to climate change. And obviously, as you mentioned, there's two different types of effects. There's the direct effects and the indirect effects. The indirect effects include things such as climate change affecting crops, livestock, fisheries, and devastation to farmlands. And I think in this case, we do need adaptive practices, and we do need to implement adaptive practices and provide civilians with the knowledge of how to go about this. We also need more financial capital from, not just from within the continent, but international as well, in order to give people give everybody the risk. I mean, look, Africa is really suffering from climate change, and they haven't contributed to the emission of global greenhouse gases. It's approximately 3% that they've contributed, but they're being affected by it a lot worse than somewhere like the United States, for example.
All right, now let's get into how. So we know we're going to have a new climate regime coming from next year
Yeah.
as an offshoot from the Paris Agreement signed in 2015.
Yeah.
So let's look at how things are going to shape up from there. I understand that part of the resolutions that are going to come into effect from next year is the fact that countries are now going to report how much emissions they put out there and what they are doing to check that. How do you see this working out?
I mean, really, it's if we have individuals reporting on this, it's a fantastic initiative. But how are we going to hold them accountable? And what we also need to look at is the political climate today. There is so much volatility, considering that the United States pulled out of the agreement. You know, we have to take these things in consideration, and how do we deal with it when something like this does happen? The UN Secretary General has been stressing for months now that we need to transition from a gray economy to a green economy, and stakeholders really need to understand now, how are we going to do this? How are we going to implement these things and reporting back? If you're not meeting your targets, how are you going to be held accountable? So it's great reporting, but how are we going to go on from there? Interesting
to see, because when you look at the geopolitical landscape, you see how things are shaping up. You're looking at US and China on one hand, with trade tariffs on the other hand, talking about the US almost threatening to put sanctions on Mexico just a couple of years ago. We're seeing the US and Iran, also another issue in there.
Yes.
And then we're now talking about an issue where countries now need to come out right and be forthright with how they are putting out greenhouse emissions.
Yes.
I'm trying to imagine how this the geopolitical landscape is going to affect the regulation of this as well.
I mean, really, it's in areas where there is democracy, how we as individuals can help is taking our social responsibility and voting the right people in power. Again, this goes down to providing education for the masses, giving them an idea of what is really going on, because there's still people that don't know what is happening or even deny that it's happening. So if we know this and we can bear this in mind, we can then hold our governments accountable and say, what are we doing? Because these effects, they're not just coincidental. For example, let's take a farmer who is affected by the indirect effects of climate change. He can hold his government accountable. Well, what are you implementing for me? How am I going to solve this problem? How are you going to solve this problem long term? And that's something that we have to look at.
Countries have made pledges before.
Yes,
we understand that the US has pulled out, but how much has it affected other countries and what pledges they've put forward?
At this point, we have no choice. If you just look around and let's take Mozambique. Look at the devastating effects of Mozambique. I mean, how can you look at that and not accept what is happening, and how you would not want to do something to contribute towards making our planet a more habitable planet for children of the future, for grandchildren of the future? It is imminent. We really don't have a choice. I mean, yes, they've made pledges before, but it really does go to the, beg the question, when you look back in 50 to 100 years' time, when people look back, how do you want to be seen? How do people want to view you? How do you want people to remember you? What did you do? How did you make the world a better place? How did you provide a better environment for the world of the future?
All right, now let's come to the work that you do on climate change in Nigeria. Beyond advocating, I understand that you're also putting up a platform together.
Yes.
I'd like to understand what shape that is taking.
So we've just launched the Sage Innovation Center that is it's essentially a platform that gives youth the opportunity to come forth with new, bold, innovative solutions that address climate change. And also just to provide funding for a greener economy, and just to kind of show youth today, look, we don't have to go down these traditional methods that we've been doing so for the past how many years. We can find new ways. So it's opening up an economy within the green sector, but at the same time, it's also addressing. We're looking for youth that can bring forth ideas that can address the issues surrounding climate change.
We've seen some very innovative solutions come from Nigerians on, because we've had a new wave of climate entrepreneurs, as we will call it. People making things from used tires.
Yes.
People making things from plastic that have been disposed,
Yes.
single-use plastics, and all of that. But how would you see that environment? Or do you think they are getting the kind of support that they need to nurture these ideas that they have?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think that we need to support them more. I think that there needs to be, we need to scale up, essentially, the effort to bring these people to light and push them forward and encourage them. Because it's really not enough people know about it.
All over the world, we're seeing the legislatures around the world being more proactive about how they make laws around climate change. We're seeing more laws coming out on single-use plastics, helping to curb some of that menace of plastics in the world. Do you think that our lawmakers here in this part of Africa, are doing quite enough on that front?
No, we're drowning in plastic. And I think a lot of places, wherever you go in the world today, you will notice the impacts of plastic. Even if you go to the deepest parts of the ocean, you will still find plastic. On a recent field trip that I took to Côte d'Ivoire with UNICEF, I'm a big UNICEF supporter, they have implemented a circular economy. So they have collaborated with a company known as Celcius Plásticos that utilizes plastic waste. They buy plastic waste from the community and they make bricks. Now, these bricks are used to make housing and schooling. They've started with schooling for now, but I'm sure in the future they will expand and make whatever they can with it. And it's so neat. Because the schools were fireproof, earthquake-proof, flood-proof, and it's hitting so many of the Sustainable Development Goals implemented by the United Nations. So it's not just cleaning up the environment; it's taking care of life on land. It's taking care of life below water, which has really been affected by plastic.
I just need to take a quick break. I've been speaking to Naza Alakija. She's a climate change advocate and the founder of Sage Innovation Center. If you're just joining us, I have with me Naza Alakija. She's a climate change advocate and the founder of Sage Innovation. And we're talking climate change. Naza, a very interesting first half we had with that. And you're making some very interesting points. But I'd like to know, yes, holding African governments, more accountable, yes, on one hand, it sounds very, very, very plausible, but then you have to look at the global landscape. There are still contentions to, the effects of climate change in there. What would you like to say to the skeptics who do not believe that, this is really an issue and that probably it's just one of the things and the earth is just going through a cycle?
You have to be very naive to think that climate change is not real and it's not happening. And I just want to touch on the fact, yes, we have to hold our governments accountable, but really, as I mentioned previously, Africa has really been responsible for 3% of global greenhouse emissions. What we need is international cooperation. I want to take the example of Lake Chad. Lake Chad in the 1960s covered approximately 25,000 square kilometers. Today it's 4,000, well in 2014 it was estimated at around 4,800 square kilometers. That's a drastic, it's drastically shrunk, and it's affecting the livelihood of people that depend on it for economic opportunities. And essentially we need global cooperation. We need these big countries that have polluted and have caused the effects of climate change to come forth and take corporate social responsibility and say, okay, this is what we've done. How do we solve it? How can we help? And there's really just isn't enough of that at the moment. There's a lot of funding going towards places like India, China, and Mexico, but there's a trickle of that that's coming down to Africa. Yet we're suffering with the burdens of the problem more.
All right, I hear you, but I would like to see, yes, it's one thing for the big countries to come in there, but I'm looking at, there are global organizations in there. We have development finance institutions around the world who, are dealing with some of the indirect effects of climate change, or the one or the other. And I'd like to see what their role is in, helping, how much are they stepping up to solve this challenge?
I think since the United Nations has, over the past few years, started to really advocate for the effects of climate change, I think they've really pushed these international organizations to move forward and start looking at other, other means of addressing, because, say for example, you have these international organizations that are, helping in places like Venezuela and countries, in Africa, whatever foundational work they're doing in terms of education, bringing technology to Africa, it's not going to matter if there's a flood or if there's a climate emergency. People aren't going to send their kids to school when there's a flood. So I think there needs to be, even though there is awareness right now, just a little more focus on climate change and focus on how do these communities go forth if they are affected by climate change. And 9 times out of 10 in impoverished areas, they are.
I'm looking at African countries and I'm looking at the huge infrastructure challenges that some of these countries have, especially with regards to power. And now the world all over is now talking about cleaner energy.
Yeah.
And we're looking at, African governments, countries don't even have enough power as it is. And then so some will argue that, we just want power first. When we get power, then we decide whether we have clean power. What do you say to people who hold that notion?
Again, as I just said, we're at a point with climate change where if something is not done, whatever your plans are in terms of coming to power, in terms of those plans will be demolished by, climate emergencies or, natural disasters. So I think the focus really should be on how do we provide a resilient infrastructure, how do we provide a resilient environment, and then go forth and facilitate doing whatever it is that one wants to achieve within power. But it really will not matter if we're struck by climate disasters, because it will take you back to square one.
All right. Also brings to the fore the importance of insurance in all this. I see some very interesting work done by the African Risk Capacity around climate insurance. Yeah. And I'm looking at that as a very innovative way to go about, getting countries to, prepare for the future of climate. What's your thoughts?
Of course. That needs scaling up. That's the only thing I will say about that. It needs scaling up, and we need to quadruple that, essentially. There's a lot of knowledge and information available, more so now than it was about 10 years ago. But when you go into the rural areas, what insurance and what information, what resources do they have access to there? That is a question we should really be asking ourselves, because it's not just the major cities that we're targeting; it's the whole country.
Yeah, it also has a strong impact on food security, because countries are trying to improve their food self-sufficiency in a lot of many staple crops. And then take me back to what happened in Mozambique with Hurricane Haida and also Hurricane Kenneth. And I'm looking at those incidents, and I'm looking at, because according to the stats from the World Bank, those economies lost about $2 billion from just these two events alone. Very devastating talking about this. And I'd like to know, beyond the insurance though, how much more proactive the countries need to be to prevent some of this devastation from happening.
We need early warning signs and measures that will bring about early warnings for civilians, right? So let's take Cyclone Fani that just occurred in India. They were prepared. And comparing that to Mozambique, I mean, thousands of people have died, thousands of people are still missing, and if I'm not mistaken, I know that they had difficulties landing planes. I mean, it was just, there was nothing. Everything was completely demolished, and there was no resilience, there was no adaptive practices. And so, you know, the questions we really need to ask ourselves is, if our country is struck by a climate disaster tomorrow, do we have the surveillance? Do we have are our emergency services prepared for something like this? If something like this does happen, do we have access to resources such as food and water? And we really do need to take these things into consideration before, you know, and asking ourselves, are we prepared? I mean, would you know what to do if something like this happens?
But I think finance is at the heart of all of this. You know,
Yes.
the world is coming together to put money, put some funds aside for climate change effects and
Yes.
disasters. I think it will go quite a long way. I know there's some quite very interesting funds that are out there doing this, but do you think African countries are benefiting enough from these initiatives?
I think that there needs to be more focus on Africa in terms of the effects it's had from climate change, from all stakeholders globally and within the continent. More so globally, of course, because we have to hold those responsible who have initiated, as one was said, the effects of climate change.
All right, but I think some African countries are doing some very interesting stuff. Nigeria, for example, we've launched a sovereign green bond to try and raise financing to help mitigate some of the impact of climate change on the country. Do you think that's a way to go for many other countries? You know, tapping into the financial markets to get funding for to mitigate against the effects of climate change?
I think it's a start. I think, you know, the strategy that we have in place in Africa, it's great, but the markets are not big enough for us to see the impacts. And essentially, it needs to be cooperation on parts of everybody, not just Africa, but on everybody. But yeah, I think there needs to be more knowledge and information available to local banks as well on climate finance.
All right, I know later this year we're going to have COP25.
Yep.
So there's some pending issues from COP24 and the Paris Agreement that they're still being looked into. But I'd like to look at what you expect from COP25 in November and how you see the world shaping, you know, in the world of dealing with climate change going forward.
I think more action. You know, with these events, there's always they're great. They're very, you know, they provide a lot of information for the public, and they put an agreement in place. But really, how do we follow through? And, you know, taking the United States again as an example, how do we hold countries that pull out of these agreements? Because that's what essentially we got out of COP24, a handbook which we can follow. But when you have a country that pulls out, what do we do in this instance? And how do we bring harmony amongst other countries to say, hey, look, well, we're still focusing on this. Our goals and trajectories are to build a greener economy. Again, it's competitiveness as well. You know, you have countries competing with each other in terms of their economies, and well, if the U.S. is boosting up their emissions, why should we cut ours back? Because it's going to cost our economy more money. But what we need to understand is that opening a green economy it's been estimated to be $1 billion industry, if not $1 trillion industry. It's going to create a lot more jobs, a lot more financing, a lot more money, and you know that's something to consider.
All right, but when you look at this, so there's still some unresolved issues from the agreements in the Paris Agreement. You know, countries are still, you know, pushing blames here and there on how they should categorize how countries are ranked on how they emit and put emissions together. You're going to put the rich countries together and the poor countries together. A lot of all those coming in there. What kind of conversations would you like to see going into? Because we saw it was very heated when they had the last one between countries and they put their positions in there. You know, looking into later this year and the challenges that could come from that meeting in there, and how do you see them being resolved? Again,
we are at a point of emergency. The UK has declared a climate emergency. The world is at the point of an emergency. There really is no time for negotiations on well, this is shifting the blame on this country, who did this. We don't have time for that. It's just, at this point, implementing it the best way you and your country physically can, and you and your government physically can. There's no room for arguments anymore.
So implementing the Paris Agreement.
It's just implementing it as best you physically can. There's no shifting the blame and who's responsible. We're all responsible, all of us. So.
All right, then. Thank you so much for your time. It's a very interesting conversation I've been having with Naza Alakija. She's a climate change advocate and the founder of Sage Innovation Center. And that's it on Beyond Markets for today. Thank you so much for joining me on this show. Remember, you can watch the show at 5 p.m. West African time daily and have access to all previous episodes of Beyond Markets on our website at cnbcafrica.com. You can stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Markets and follow me at Kenneth Igbomo. Do have a wonderful day.